Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how a couple of ways that you can subset your data randomly, so that way you are manipulating but not including any bias in those manipulations of your sample sheets. Now what I've done so far is I have forced Excel to open this file, and one thing to point out is that while I do this, if I go to my downloads, right now it's not showing me anything, and that's because I have this all Excel files. I have to change this to all files so that my TSV, my tab separated values, or my CSV, or whatever I have my sample sheets as, pops up. Once I've done that, I get this menu that asks, do I want to parse this data so that I can determine how the column should be made. Down here, it's actually kind of hard to see, and that's because the tabs are not like a letter. They are the concept of spacing. And so tabs don't really get represented very well in that preview. However, once I come to this next tab and I use tab as delimiter, I can very clearly see that that was in fact a tab separated values table. I'm going to click next. It's just giving me a quick preview. I'm going to leave it on general because I don't want it to try and interpret my columns. And there we go. The easiest way to parse this data is to just generate some random values. And so let me zoom in a little bit so you can see this better. I'm just going to do equals RAND. That's just random, open parentheses, close parentheses. Syntax looking a little bit familiar to those of you in R, although it has to have this equal symbol. Without the equal symbol, it's just literally the characters. Oops. It's literally just the characters RAND, open parentheses, close parentheses. With the equals, it becomes the function rand. At this point, I am going to just demonstrate that I can double click on this little square bracket. I had copied it, and that's why you couldn't quite see it. But when I press escape and that copy goes away, I can see this handle quite easily. If I click on this, it's going to copy down to the end of this, this column. Sometimes if there's gaps in the column, it can be a little bit inconsistent, but this went all the way down. Now, for the record, my data is absurd because this is all of the cases in the TCGA dataset, so I believe this is all of cohort 1, maybe cohort 4. I can't remember which sample sheet this is from, but at this point, I now have random values generated to a fairly large accuracy. And so as long as I have less than, 200 and 1 billion, I'm going to do a pretty decent job if I sort by this column of randomly scrambling up the data. So to do that, I'm just going to press Control A. This would be Command A on a Mac. I've selected everything. If I had accidentally left in a column and then I press Control A, I would actually end up omitting one of those sections because of this gap. And so sometimes it's helpful to just kind of make your columns a little bit more spread out. That way you know where everything's ending. But in the end, as long as your data is all together, you press Control A, it will select it all. I'm going to go to Sort, Custom Sort. I'm going to say my data has headers, although the column I am selecting is the one without a header, which is column L. It doesn't really matter which direction I sort it because those numbers are randomly generated. And for the record, they're going to be sorted based on their current value. And then once that sorting has completed, those random values are going to be recalculated. So they're not going to look sorted. But that is how this is going to work. It's going to base this on the current value. I run that. Like I said, these got reorganized, so we don't see their original value anymore. We would have needed to copy and paste those as just values had we wanted to see what that sorting actually was using. However, I don't really care what that sorting was using. I just wanted it to randomly scramble up my data. I could then remove the samples I want to remove, and I could save a subset. Now before I do that, I'm going to remove that last column. And I'll be honest, I don't actually know if this is going to work. There's a common problem where there's basically blanks left in the data set wherever there used to be data. And I'm not sure what Excel is going to do, but I will show you how to check this, which is the much more important skill. So I'm going to save this file. I'm going to keep it as a TSV, so that way I don't have to change stuff downstream. Oh, does it not do TSV? Tab delimited. Okay, so I'm formatting it as a tab. I'm giving it the actual file extension .tsv. We'll see what it does. It may, yeah. Actually, I wanted to subset. There we go. So I don't override it, and that way I can easily backtrack. If I then go into my file, and yes, I can see that it did indeed add TSV and .txt. I like to use TSV. A TSV file is just a text file, so there is no problem with that. When I try to rename it to remove that extension and just leave it as TSV, it's giving me a control issue. It's because I still have it open in Excel, so if I close that down and then try again, it now accepts it. If I then visualize it in Notepad, we're going to see if there was any extra data left over. So there's a lot of different edit files, but as I scroll down, I can see that there was a lot of leftover data. And so, this is a problem. We have to remove this downstream. The nice thing is it didn't leave a column in. That can also sometimes be a problem, but there wasn't an extra column here. This is very easy to fix, though. So if I just open that back up in Excel, and you may have needed to do the import step I did before. And what I've done now is I've pressed Control A, and I'm just going to open up a new sheet and save it again. And since a TSV file can't contain multiple sheets, essentially this first sheet is going to be discarded. But since I only copy and pasted the new data, all of those extra blanks will have been removed. And I can prove that by then opening it back up in my text editor. And I can see, yes, indeed, I now have 49 total samples. Probably should have left an extra one in there, just keep that 50th. But there you go. So there you go. There it is. There is one method for subsetting randomly across different rows. This is a method I use actually fairly commonly. Oftentimes, I prefer this over using R for something like this because it's just a separate file. And in the end, I really need to be looking at these files and checking to make sure there aren't any errors anyways. And so I'm often already going to be going through some of these data wrangling steps where I'm just trying to make sure my data looks right and it's formatted correctly. Now, to show how to do this in R, I simply just need to open up R. I will then need to import the data as an object, and I'm not going to do this in my pipeline file because I don't really want this process in my pipeline. I just want this documented via my files. And so, if I was going to do anything, I would probably just put this document as like a side-along function, or honestly, I would normally just describe it. The process of randomly subsetting data is fairly self-contained. You don't really need to provide evidence that you did that. So I'm going to move to my downloads directory. A little bit easier to say than to do. It'd probably be easier to just move that file into my documents file. Let me get my face off the screen. And yeah, that's probably the best way to do that, but let's actually demonstrate. That's not a bad trick to show you. So I can click on here, I can show Vault folder in new window. I can then go to my downloads, move those into my documents, refresh this view. And there we go. If I sort by modified date, I see it at the top. Now at this point, I'd want to just visualize that data. Checking to make sure that that data looks good and is well formatted. Let me make my screen a little bit smaller smaller so that you can see the bottom. There we go. Yeah. And I'm going to import it now. So this is just making sure that I can see everything. So I got to be on the right monitor. All right, that looks good. I don't really care what it's called. I'm just going to say SAMDF. Oh, that's bad. We've already used that one. Sample file 1. All right. Import. Okay, looking at this, it's got column names. That all looks pretty good. Now that I have that, I'm going to make sure I copy my code so that I can replicate this process. I'm going to save my script file so that, again, I can replicate this process. And I'm just going to save it here because I'm not actually trying to, I don't want to show you all my stuff. So week 12 random sample selector.r. All right. Now that I have that, I'm just going to create a vector. That vector is going to be based on the sample function, which has an argument called x, which is the values we're going to choose from. This is sampling from a hat situation, so a continuous sampling. I'm going to choose a certain number of values, and I'm going to have to make a decision on should I replace things after I select them. Since I'm sampling rows, no, I don't want to replace them. I don't want any duplicate rows. Now, the things I'm going to select from, I can't select from like the row directly. I'm sure there's ways to make that work. But the sample function at its core is sampling typically a vector. And so I'm just going to make a vector. I'm going to say 1 through the number of rows of sample file. There we go. In row, sample file. There we go. The size, let's do 50, pretty safe number. You've got a lot of power in your data set. Oh, and it says cannot take a sample larger than the population when replace equals false. And that's because I accidentally picked the subset version. So let me just redo that. Now my sample file is the right size. Cool. Now when I try to sample this, there's not going to be a problem because 1 through n row is a very large vector, and the size is 50. There we go. Here's what it was this time. Here's what it is next time. If I want to make this something that is going to act the same way each time, I could use the set.seed function. And now every time I run this, it's choosing the same rows. Sampled rows. There we go. And let's use that in an extraction. Looking good. We can see that my original data set was not good, but that's all right. And with that, I now have my subset data frame. Now, I do still want to write this to a file. Write dot, and I have to make some decisions. Do I want to write to a TSV? Do I want to write it to a table? Well, my original data was based on a tab delimited file. The best way to do that would not be a CSV because that's going to be a comma separated values table. All I would have to do is change my pipeline's read dot function in order to use that CSV file, which is quite easy, but I'm going to switch over to read dot table. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to base it on this name. I'm going to say R subset so that I know which one I'm looking at. One thing to note, you just have to have done some research here, is the argument that allows you to determine what separator to use. So instead of comma, to use a tab. You can't see it on my screen right now. To use a tab, you just define what goes in between each value. So if I wanted to make it a comma, I could add a comma here. Instead, though, I'm going to use \T, which represents a tab character, which is like kind of a unique piece of code to save into the file. Okay, finally, I'm going to just test this, make sure that it is what I want. And so I'm going to do a read .delim. I'm going to try to make sure it works all the same way as before, so I'm just going to copy and paste actually. But I'm going to replace this with my new file name. And I'm going to just double check it. Test df, why not? And if I look at this file, yep, that looks the same. My column names still look good. If I really wanted to prove it to myself, I could call the col names function. And I could say, are each of those col names equal to the col names in subset samples? And yes, indeed, they are. In other words, I'm good. I've tested it. I feel good about this. I'm going to hit Control S. And now all I have to go do is modify my pipeline to go use either this one or the other subset file. Just make sure you make a choice and test it to make sure you know what's happening, because it is very easy and very common to kind of just get confused and accidentally leave out or use the wrong data set. But anyways, that's the idea. I hope that helped, and reach out if you have any questions. Bye.